So we are talking about being blessed, and we're talking about one of the questions that I have had, reading this passage, and maybe you have had it too, and that is, what's wrong with Esau? Right? I mean, maybe I should go back and just make sure we all know the story a little bit, right? Esau and Jacob are brothers, and they're twin brothers, and Esau is the older twin by 10 minutes or whatever it might be. But in the culture of that time, he was the one who was supposed to inherit. He was the firstborn. He was the one who was supposed to receive his father's blessing and receive, the best portion of the inheritance. But it didn't happen for Esau, right? Esau went through life as second fiddle for whatever reason. And why is that? Why did God choose one and not the other? And is that fair? Right? Was that the right thing to do? And I've always wondered about that. And so there's really 5 reasons that it wasn't Esau that received the blessing of God. And so I just wanted to talk about that. And it goes to us too, because we can take this as a negative example, right? We can say, if we would like to be blessed of God, I would, you guys too, I presume, would prefer God's blessing over God's cursing. Yeah, okay, good. But then we should probably not follow the example of Esau. Right? We should probably avoid the things that Esau is doing here in this passage. Now, I picked this particular passage to read because, honestly, there's this big, long portion of Scripture that talks about Esau. It starts in chapter 25 and really goes into chapter 28, the part that I want to talk about. I didn't want to read the whole thing because I know there's cookies down there you guys all want to get to. But I guess the point is that this is a long period of time, right? This is not something that all happened in the same week or the same month or the same year, right? The first part that we're going to talk about here is before the twins were born. And the last part we're going to talk about is after they are married, right? So it's taking some time here. These are vignettes. These are little pictures of the story that God has provided to us so that we can understand exactly what's going on. So let's start with that. The first reason that Esau wasn't the blessed one is because Esau wasn't in control. Right? Now that's your first point on your outline. And in a way that seems pretty obvious to say as I'm standing up in front of a church. Esau's not in control. God is in control. God is sovereign over everything. God is the one who makes the choice. And that's what sometimes as we're reading the scriptures we don't really get. We forget that, right? We think that God has to behave in a certain way because that's my standard. But my ways are not God's ways. And so God chooses who he wants and what he wants and when he wants, and he's the one that makes it happen. In chapter 25, if you're using the Pew Bible, it's just a page away, so that's easy. But before the two are even born, Rebecca, their mother, is pregnant with twins, and I've never been pregnant with twins, but I understand it's not the most comfortable thing. And these two twins were in there fighting with each other, evidently. And Rebecca goes to the Lord and says, Lord, what are you doing here? And the Lord says to Rebecca, and I quote from verse 23, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger. So before they were even born, God has proclaimed that Jacob is going to get the blessing instead of Esau. All right? Now, these are 2 unborn babies, right? They're both totally innocent before God. They haven't done anything wrong. It's simply God's choice. In the same way that God has chosen each of us to have a purpose in our lives and to be elected into his service, not because of anything that we've done, not because of our parentage or our education or our brilliance or anything like that. God has sovereignly chose to put us where he wants us for his purpose. Now, I also have to say it's important that we understand that we're talking about a specific blessing here, right? It's not that Esau was cursed to a life of slavery or torture or anything like that. Esau still had a pretty good life, right? He was born into a family. He was loved by his father, and he got to do what he wanted to do, and they were well off. And Esau had a good, blessed life, without a doubt. But he didn't have the main blessing that was available to that family. Only one of them could be in the line of the Messiah. Only one of them could be the group from whom Jesus came, and God chose Jacob. So he was blessed. Esau was blessed. But in the end, God knows, and God decides, and we have to decide, are we committed to following God's plan for our lives? You guys are all blessed, right? Yes. Yes, we are among the most blessed people in all the world. We are all blessed, and yet we may not have the blessing that we want. Did you hear that somebody just won $1.8 billion last week? Boy, that would have been a nice blessing. Maybe not. I don't know. But the point is, we could all be mad at God and say, God, why didn't I win the 1.8? But we have to trust that God knows best. I know that we may not get the blessing of wealth, we may not get the blessing of a career, we may not get the blessing of you fill in the blank, but still, it's God who has placed us where he wants, and we need to be committed to that, committed to being the people that God has called us to be, where God has called us to be. Which brings us to point number 2, and that is, before I get there, I have to say, God knew all of this, right? God is sovereign. He's all-knowing. He knew what Esau was going to be. And so the reason that Esau didn't get the blessing that Esau wanted to get is because Esau wasn't going to live the life that God wanted him to live. Right? And God knew that even before they were born. So God used Jacob instead of Esau. And by the way, Jacob was no great shakes either, as we're going to see in the coming weeks. But God knew that Esau wasn't going to be the kind of man that God was going to bless with this most important calling, making sure the Messiah's line was maintained. So the first part was Esau wasn't God, Esau wasn't sovereign, Esau didn't get to make the decision. The second point is Esau wasn't committed. All right, as they get older, remember I said this goes over years and years, so after the twins are born and after they grow up, and Esau's out hunting somewhere, and Jacob, he's in the tent there making some soup. And it's in chapter 25, verses 29 through 34. I'm not going to read it, but you can read it later. You've probably heard the story before anyway. Esau comes in from the field and he's hungry. And he says to Jacob, give me some soup. And Jacob says, give me your birthright. Right? Because Esau was still the older brother. He still had the birthright. And so Jacob says, give that to me and I'll give you some soup. And what did Esau do? Did he say, no way? No, this birthright is the most important thing in my life. This is what God has made me for. This is what I need and what I want. And, I'll starve to death before I give that away. Nope. You've all heard the story. He sold his birthright for a bowl of soup. And as an aside, it was lentil soup. It wasn't even good soup. You know what I mean? So it was Esau putting his hunger over the call of God in his life, right? I mean, now this wasn't a legal document, right? I'm sure that had they gone before God and Jacob said, well, I have the right because I bought it with a bowl of soup. That wasn't legal at all, but it showed a problem in Esau's heart. It showed him he wasn't committed to taking care of his birthright, of taking care of that particular call in his life, if he had it. Now, I don't think he knew he didn't have it at that point, right? Would you tell your kids that? Would you tell your twins when they got to be, 10, 11, 12, oh, by the way, God picks this one over this one? So I think Esau probably just assumed that he still had the birthright, but he didn't care. He wanted the soup. And how often do we do that? How often do we have a call of God in our life, something important, something God has given us to do, a task, and yet we would rather have probably not lentil soup, but some form of creature comfort, right? Whether it's food or whether it's rest or whether it's a nicer house or time off on a Sunday morning, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here when I say that, but how often do we put the call of God or put our own desires, our own hunger for whatever, over the call of God? That's what Esau did here. And so the question is, how committed are you to the task that God has given you? And it's different for all of us, right? We all have different gifting and different talent and different calls from God, and we each have to decide, are we going to do that? Are we committed to that? Or are we going to put ourselves over that, put our own hungers over that. Esau decided to go with the hunger. We have to decide how committed we are to the call of God in our lives. Why not Esau? He wasn't that committed. He wasn't willing to put his birthright, he wasn't willing to hold that up as something that he would hang on to no matter what. Third point, so we have Esau wasn't in charge, Esau wasn't committed. The third point is that Esau wasn't particularly obedient either. We see that in chapter 26, 34. Now you remember that when Abraham was going to find a wife for Isaac, he said, "You may not marry any woman from this land. You got to go back to your old homeland and you got to marry a wife from there." Remember that? That was the rule. You were not to marry women from the land of Canaan because God was, again, protecting the line of his Messiah. And so in chapter 26, verse 34, it says, "When Esau was 40 years old, he took to wife Judith, the daughter of Bariam the Hittite, and Basemeth, the daughter of Elon the Hittite." So he takes wives from the land. He doesn't do what God is wanting people to do. And by the way, he takes multiple wives as well, which wasn't the point either. But he did it, and it went down and became a problem later. But we'll talk about that later in a couple of weeks. But the point is, he wasn't obedient. All right, Esau wasn't obedient to make sure the wife that he took was someone that God would approve of. That's the point here. He knew. He did it anyway. And by the way, it goes on to say, "And they," that is those daughters, and they, his wives, "made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah." All right? So they didn't like his wives too much. I don't know what they did to make it bitter, but for whatever reason, they didn't get along too well. God wasn't pleased, and God knew before Esau was born that he was going to do this. He was going to take wives from the land, and so he was disobedient. Partnership, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, partnership is important. God wanted to make sure that the line of the Messiah was brought up correctly. The women from the land weren't going to do that. So God didn't bless Esau. Why wasn't Esau blessed? Because he wasn't obedient to what he knew to be true. And you know where I'm going with this, right? What about you? Are you obedient to what God has said? Right? If we're asking God to bless us, then we need to be willing to obey the information that we already have. And we have an entire book of information that God will guide us in our decision making, but we have to choose to be obedient to that. It's amazing to me how often I get calls from people who want help from the church, right? I mean, and that's fine. I have no problem with that. I have no problem helping people. But I always ask them, what church do you go to? You know, where do you worship God? And usually they don't. They have no church. They have no religious upbringing, or maybe they have an upbringing, but they have no activity in their life. And I think to myself, okay, so now you're coming to God, but you weren't willing to be obedient in the past. You weren't willing to follow him until you needed help. Now, that's a good thing in some ways because it gives me and gives us as a church the opportunity to share the gospel with them, right? Their need brings them to Christ. But still, we need, as Christians, to make a decision to obey if we expect the blessing of God. If you're going to turn your back on God and walk away from his ways that he talks about in the scripture, then you can't expect him to come back and bless you. It's not that he doesn't love you. It's not that we are going to heaven because of Christ's work on the cross. That's not what's in view here. I want to make sure you understand, I'm not making some kind of line that if you don't obey, God won't love you anymore. That's not the point. We're talking about blessing. And we have all been blessed. And we will all continue to be blessed. But the blessing of being used by God in his ministry and in his work is contingent on us obeying the word, what we already know. You guys are good with that? Yeah, me too. Until there's a choice to make. And then we waffle. All right. So first of all, Esau wasn't blessed because he wasn't in charge. He wasn't blessed because he wasn't committed. He wasn't blessed because he wasn't obedient. And he wasn't blessed because he wasn't God-centered. right? He was consistently, throughout this whole passage about his lifetime, he was consistently putting his own desires above God's. It's very similar to being committed, but a little bit different. He was the center of his universe, right? I mean, in just a snippet in chapter 27, verse 36. Let's see, Esau says, and by the way, this is after he got ripped off from his point of view of that blessing that Isaac was going to give him. Rebekah's plan worked, and Jacob got the blessing, and Esau didn't. And Esau is furious about that, right? He is so angry that he's been taken out of the mainstream of the Messiah, and he's angry. And he says in verse 36, "Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing." Right? It's about me, my birthright, my blessing. That darn brother of mine, I hate him. And by the way, later he starts to plot the murder of Jacob because he hates him so much for the blessing that has been taken away. But it was all about him. He didn't stop to think, well, what is God doing in this? What is God's plan in this? What's happening here from God's point of view? It was all about him. And we have to be careful of that too. We have to be careful that we are keeping God's point of view in mind. Do you get angry? Do I get angry sometimes when things don't go my way? Yeah. I'm sure you guys do too, right? It's a very human thing. But hopefully we stop and we hold aside. We don't plan on murdering anybody. And we think, what is God's plan in this? We begin to look to see how is God moving and how can I adjust my thoughts or my emotions? How can I join in what God's doing instead of fighting against it? How can I be God-centered instead of Jim-centered? And that's how we are blessed as we begin to see things from God's perspective. And life becomes more and more of a blessing as God works in us because we have a God-centered point of view. And then, of course, Esau, he wasn't really understanding. That's your 5th point in there, is Esau wasn't understanding what was going on. I think he really didn't get it. In chapter 28, verses 8 and 9, so here we are in the story now. Jacob has received the blessing, and Isaac says to him, correctly now, "You cannot marry a woman from this land. Go back to your mother's hometown and find a woman there. Marry her." And Jacob does that. Esau overhears that conversation. And what does he think to himself? He thinks, the reason I didn't get the blessing is because I married the wrong women. If I had just gone and married someone from this other spot, then I would have gotten the blessing. Maybe I can fix it. Maybe I can make it work after all. And so in chapter 28, verses 8, it says, "So when Esau saw that the Canaanite women did not please Isaac his father, Esau went to Ishmael and took to wife, besides the wives he had, Malahath the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Neboleth." Right? So Esau begins to try to manipulate the situation. He says, aha, my wives aren't good enough. I'm going to go get another wife, and that'll fix everything. Now I can be, in the line of the Messiah. Now my Father will bless me. Does that work? Never. Have you ever tried to manipulate God? I have. If I do this, God, then you'll do this. Right? I did that a lot. I've told you before, that's how I began giving blood. I was my teens, and I had done some stuff I shouldn't have been doing, and I was worried, and I said, Lord, I'll tell you what. They want to stick me with this big needle to take my blood. I will go be stuck with the needle if you will not allow these consequences to fall on me. God doesn't go for that. But I thought, maybe I can do it. And we do that too, right? If only I do this, then God won't do that. Or if only I do this, then God will do that. Esau was trying to manipulate God. We can't manipulate God. And that's the 5th point, is Esau wasn't understanding the nature of this blessing and the nature of God. And how often do we misunderstand that as well? If we want to be blessed, right, and that's back to that original title, if we want to be blessed, we need to make sure that we are doing things God's way and putting God first in our lives, that we're committed to Him, we're obedient to Him, we have a God-centered attitude, and that we are understanding who exactly we're dealing with here. The Creator of all, our Maker, Defender, and Friend. I mean, our God is worthy of all worship. And so we have to realize that A, we already are blessed. Right? We ought to be thankful for what we have. And then that God is in control. And our job is simply to follow Him wherever He leads and join Him wherever He calls us to join Him. So that's what we're going to think about as Rich plays our meditation time. That's what we're going to think about this coming week is how has God blessed me already? And how does He want me to join Him